Hello, and welcome to Fair Trade, a Faith Unfiltered podcast series where courageous people share the candid stories of their faith journey and what brought them to Community of Christ. I'm your host, Blake Smith, and today I'm here with Jennifer Toone. Welcome, Jennifer, and thanks so much for being with us here today at Faith Unfiltered.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So we like to start off by letting our guests tell us a little bit about themselves, kind of a get to know you quickly. If you wouldn't mind, how about you introduce yourself to our listeners and just whatever you would say to someone if you were meeting them for the first time.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Toone, and I was born and raised in California, the northern part. I grew up in the Bay Area and have spent most of my life here. I have a teaching credential, and I teach music to elementary schoolers, and I have 6 kids, and it's a busy mom life for me.
So you're teaching at home and you got a full classroom at home.
Yes, I'm teaching in multiple places, yes.
So what's the age range of your kids?
My oldest just turned 18 this week, and my youngest is 5.5.
Wow. Okay. Very good. Girls and boys?
Yes, I have 4 boys and 3 girls.
Awesome. Well, now we just want to hear your story, and I'm so glad that you're willing to do that. I know that it creates some vulnerable space, but it's also very helpful. Let's start from the beginning. Like, where were you born, and just go from there.
Okay. Well, I was born in Walnut Creek, California, and my parents at the time were living in Livermore and moved to Tracy when I was just a couple months old. And they were very, very faithful Latter-day Saints. And I was the second oldest of 6 kids. And we lived in Tracy till I was about 4. I don't have a whole lot of memories about church or faith from the time. I remember singing in church, and I really loved singing always, forever, everywhere I went. And then when I was not quite 5, we moved to Dublin, which is in the East Bay. And we were members of the Dublin ward. And yeah, things were not easy for me there. I started school when I was not quite 6, and a member of our ward took a disliking to me. And so starting at about age 6, I had my 6th birthday party, and we invited all the girls from my class. And one of the girls from my class was a girl that I knew at church. And I had recently been told by my mother that another adult at church had complimented my singing voice and told me what a pretty singing voice I had. And I was so excited about that. And in my 6-year-old innocence, I thought, I'm going to sing for all my friends. It'll be so fun. And so I got up and sang for my friends. And over the next few months, I stopped getting invitations for play dates. I stopped getting invitations for people's birthday parties. People stopped playing with me on the playground, and I couldn't figure out what was going on. And sometime in 1st grade, I was over at a friend's house, one of the few friends I had left. And I asked her, I said, nobody wants to be my friend. I don't understand why. And she said that this other young woman, we were children. This other child from church had told everyone that I had sung at my birthday party because I thought I was better than everybody else. So nobody wanted to be my friend. And I was crushed. I was devastated. I couldn't understand why anyone would think that just because I had been excited to sing. And so that kind of ostracization, is that how you pronounce that word? Something like that. That I was continually ostracized after that. And so as I was growing, I would frequently say to my parents, like, why don't I have any friends? Like, everybody at church is really, really mean to me, and nobody likes me. And the answer I was always given was, well, people aren't perfect. People have the ability to make their own choices, but the church is true and the church is perfect. So you just have to just keep going, whether you have friends or not. I was like, but we're taught not to treat people like this. Why am I being excluded in this way? And there were several other instances, especially as we got into being teenagers, being bad-mouthed behind my back and walking in on it, having little sideways snide comments all the time, particularly from this particular girl. And so I kind of went all the way through high school, never really having any friends because we went to all the same schools. We went to the same elementary school, the same middle school, the same high school. And she took her kind of bullying and ostracizing tactics everywhere we went. She didn't limit it to just be when we were at church. She did it everywhere with all the people who weren't members of the church. And so I grew up without very many friends and not really understanding what I was doing wrong and often blaming myself. I just must not understand how to be a friend. I just must be doing something wrong. Something's wrong with me. So it took me a long time into my 30s before I figured out that it wasn't something I did. It wasn't my fault. And I was growing up in a very large family. And my parents were my mother especially, very militantly enforced strict gender roles. And she was also very homophobic. And she had a sister who was gay. And I remember going to visit my aunt. She lived in Oakland with her partner. And my mom never called my aunt's partner her partner or anything like that. She just called it my aunt's friend. But we knew her as Aunt Louise. And I loved Aunt Louise. I thought she was just so fantastic. And I loved my mom's sister, my Aunt Kirsten. I loved her. We would go over, and she lived near Lake Merritt in Oakland, and we would go over sometimes and visit and have so much fun. And they'd let us watch Pee Wee Herman when we were over. And I remember one time when we were over, like my older brother kind of pulled me aside. I was like 8, he was like 9. And he was like, "Don't you know?" And I was like, "Don't I know what?" Like, I don't understand what I'm being pulled aside to be told. He's like, "Don't you know Aunt Kirsten's gay?" And I was like, I don't even know what that means. I was 8. I didn't understand what that meant. And I was like, I don't understand. What do you mean? And he was like, "Haven't you noticed there's only one bed in their apartment?" Okay. Again, I was 8. And he went on to explain to me that meant that they were doing things that mom and dads do. And it's so disgusting. And couldn't you figure out that they were gay because they let us watch Pee Wee Herman? And I was like, he was so angry. And I couldn't figure out why. It didn't make sense to me. I was like, but I love Aunt Louise and I love Aunt Kirsten, and I don't understand why this is a problem. And so it was just lots of little things like that in my family as I grew up. My mom making all kinds of little comments all the time about people who were different. And I always there's a song that was a primary song. The primary in the LDS church is the organization for the kids from age 18 months to age 12. And there's lots of music and fun and games involved. There's a song that was written by Cheryl Lynn Pearson, and it's called "I'll Walk With You." It was my most favorite song. And some of the lyrics go, "If you don't walk like most people do, some people walk away from you, but I won't. I'll walk with you. I'll talk with you. That's how I'll show my love for you." And so that really, that sunk deep into my soul. And it didn't jive with the things I was seeing about the way I was treated, about the way my family was treating other people. And so there was always this little bit in the back of my head that was saying something wasn't right. Something was wrong. But I didn't know any different. I was told the church was true and that's what you had to accept. And my dad was a convert. My mom was the only member in her family because the rest of her family had been members, but they left the church. And so my mom talked a lot about how they were prideful and how they thought they knew better than God. And they left the church because they thought that science and logic and all those sorts of things could tell them better than the prophets. And so I had that in my brain all the time.
Right.
And I didn't dare step out of line because I didn't want that to be turned on me. So I spent my growing up years with all the doubts about how poorly people were treated and how unkind people in the LDS church were among each other. And the things that they said over the pulpit, even about people who were gay or people of different racial identities or people who were disabled. And it just kind of just sat back there, in my brain, waiting till I was ready, right? So I graduated high school in 1999, and I got into UC Berkeley. And so that's where I went to college. But the BART train, the light rail there in the Bay Area, came all the way to Dublin. And so I would take the BART train in to school because it only came a block from the Berkeley campus. And so I was living at home because it was expensive to not live at home. And so even though I was in this super liberal school community, I wasn't ever really part of that community because I was still living at home. I was commuting to campus, and I was hearing family and my mom especially talk about how, oh, you're so good and faithful. You're not going to be swayed by the crazies on the Berkeley campus. And so, I would hear things that would make sense, but then I would have to dismiss them. I would have to push them away. I would have to do all kinds of mental gymnastics to make the LDS worldview I'd grown up with fit what I was hearing, or dismiss what I was hearing if I couldn't make it fit. And yeah, so that was my whole growing up years. I never really rebelled. I was too afraid, and I loved my family, and I didn't want them to turn on me and talk bad about me. So I just kept trying to be the best good little Mormon girl I could possibly be.
It sounds like you were just carrying this incredible weight. I mean, from an early childhood, first of all, being kind of ostracized, as you mentioned, by these friends who were in the church. They were supposed to, and you were trying to be the best that you could be, and yet this was what they were doing. You're not getting the support from home because they're just saying, well, people are people, but church is true. So you've got this disconnect going on even from an early age that just continues into college, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Just this huge disconnect that for a long time, I worked really hard to ignore it. I worked really hard to ignore it. And I finished my bachelor's degree and went on to get a teaching credential because I decided I was going to do that when I was 6. And I got my teaching credential, and after I got my credential, I was interviewing for jobs, and there was a job that I interviewed for in San Jose, and something about it didn't feel right. I remember coming home from that interview and being like, I think the interview went well. My mom was like, great. So you think you'll get a job offer? And I'm like, I don't know. I was like, but I don't know. I don't know. Something about it doesn't. So I don't know if I want a job up there. And my mom was very rigidly, you will take it. If they offer you a job, you will take it, period. And I was like, but if it doesn't feel like it's a good fit to me, why would I do that? But still, even at 24, I was living at home, and I was afraid to go, to openly say anything against my parents. And so I remember just desperately praying. And that wasn't something I did a whole lot as a kid. Like, I had been told you're supposed to pray every day, but I could never really get into it. It wasn't my thing. When I really felt the most connection to any kind of a higher power, it was when I was singing, when I was playing music. And so I was like, well, isn't music the prayer of the heart? Doesn't that count? But I actually for once in my life, was really okay, I'm desperate. I need to kneel down and pray. And I remember very specifically just having one request. God, if I don't feel like I'm supposed to go to take a job in San Jose, if that's really what your will is that I don't go to San Jose, I don't want that job offer. Don't let that job offer come, because I can't say no to my parents. And I did not get a job offer from San Jose. And I was like, guess I wasn't supposed to go.
Oh, darn.
Oh, darn. So I was working as a temp over the summer Like after I had gotten my credential, and I had graduated from my credential program in December. And since it's mid-year, it's hard to like find a permanent teaching position mid-year. And I had found a long-term sub position that started in January. A teacher, her husband had gotten a job in San Diego, and so they had to move. And so I was able to take over a classroom. But when that was over, I was just a sub, so I didn't have any kind of permanent position. So I was working as a temp over the summer and looking for teaching jobs. And I came home from my temp job for lunch on one day. And a friend of my mom's from church was out on the porch saying goodbye. And I was like, I forgot my lunch. I got to run in and grab it really quick and run back to work. I'm running out of my lunch hour time because I live like 20 minutes from work and I only had a 40-minute work period.
Oh, no.
So lunch period, I was like, I got to punch it. And so I was like, I'll just work and eat at my desk because this is what I got to do. And my mom introduced me to her friend as I was kind of like rushing in, trying to grab my food, and explained to her friend that I had just gotten my credential and I was looking for jobs. And her friend was like, oh, I have a friend who is a principal in Alameda and they are looking for teachers. They have a second grade position open that they haven't been able to fill. And school starts in like 2 weeks. And so that night I put in my application, I got an interview, and I got the job for that fall and started putting together my classroom. And a couple of weeks before that, I had been like, the Mormon church has singles wards. They're just meat markets. They want you to marry in the church. They want you to marry in the temple. And so they get all the single people in the area into one ward so that they're not in a ward with families because they want you to meet each other and get married. And so I had been going to various of them over the summer. And only a couple of weeks before I got this job interview, I had been at the singles ward in Hayward. And they were having a little potluck thing after church. And so I was standing around talking to a couple people I knew. And this young man told all his friends and said, hey, guys, move over. Give the ladies a seat. And ushered me to come sit next to him. And this young man was named Jeff Toone. And so that was how I met Jeff. And I remember thinking, oh, what a gentleman, how gentlemanly of him. And there were no other chairs set up. So he made his friends like get up and set up chairs for themselves so that I could sit in the chairs that they vacated.
This is a guy who knows what he's doing.
Right. So he invited me, like he and some other people were getting together that evening to play board games at his apartment in Alameda. And so he invited me to come over. And so I went over and we played a bunch of board games and had a grand old time and exchanged phone numbers and all the things. And so we had met up a couple other times with other groups doing things over the past couple of weeks. When I got the job in Alameda, I was like, oh, I know people who live here. This is great. This is fantastic. So as I was looking for an apartment, his apartment actually came up on like the listing at the local, like the apartment manager companies. And his apartment was on the list. And I had been through and looked at a whole bunch of other apartments because I was like, I am not commuting every day from Dublin to Alameda. I'm not. The traffic is terrible in the Bay Area. And I was like, no, I'm not. And Bart didn't go to Alameda. So I was like, I'm not driving this every day. I need to find an apartment. And so his apartment showed up and I was like, oh, I didn't know he was moving. And so I called him and was like, hey, your apartment's on this little listing. Do you mind if I come over and take a look? And so I went over and we talked, and he and his roommate were moving into a house with a couple other guys just a couple blocks over. So they were renting. It was a full-size 2-story house, but it was in one of those communities where there's like less than 5 feet of a backyard. So almost a condo, but not a condo. So it was a thing in the early 2000s, especially here in California. So they were moving and I was like, perfect. I'm just going to I'm going to apply for this apartment then. And so I did, and I got the apartment and I found a roommate. And so we like to joke that we met and then I moved into his apartment. Because it's so
we don't have to tell the whole truth, just the exciting part that makes it interesting.
Right. Because it was so scandalous in the Mormon community.
Oh my gosh.
You don't move in with each other. Good heavens. And so we liked to lean a little on the scandalous side of things just to push buttons because it was funny to us. And I can look back now and be like, yeah, I know why it was funny, because I thought these were ridiculous rules, but I wasn't articulating that in my brain, you know.
So much for the good little Mormon girl.
Right? Well, and he was in the Coast Guard, so he was in the military, and my parents had always told me to beware of military guys. And he had some tattoos. Yes. So I was that was like the extent of my rebellion. I was going to go date this guy who he rebelled as a teenager and got tattoos and lived on the wild side a little bit. My parents were kind of nervous about me meeting him and marrying him. And I was like, well, I like him, so too bad.
There you go. Let me stop you for a minute because I just want to check in. So I know we were talking about the high school, through the high school years and even into early college and still living at home, and this disconnect that was going on. You have this favorite song that you like, but what you're experiencing in the faith community, what you're experiencing even in family is not what you're singing about, which is so important to your soul. Are you still sensing that through this introductory time with Jeff, or is it kind of calmed down for a little bit?
It calms down for a little bit because I was so like wrapped up in this period with Jeff. Like I was able to kind of ignore it. And he had left the church and he had come back. And so he was like super like, I got to be super good. I got to do all the things right. And so I was the ideal candidate, this super good, faithful girl who'd been faithful forever. And so I was able to put it kind of on the back burner for a while.
Okay.
And it kind of calmed down, and I wasn't thinking about it. And Jeff and I had a lot of conversations about like what we believed and how we believed, and the things that we were talking about, like, it appeared that we agreed on everything. We were in all the right exact same place. We found out much later that we were not as closely aligned as we thought.
Not quite so in sync after all.
Right. But at the time, it was like, oh, well, this is working out so well. You know, my mom's church friend just happened to be there at just the right time. And I got this job, and then I met Jeff. And so everything's linking up perfectly. So this must all be truth and everything my parents have told me. So everything's fine now, right?
Ordained of God.
Right. Hand of God, there's no other explanation for any of this. And in talking with Jeff, I learned that at a period of time when he was kind of deciding where he wanted to be stationed next, his two top contenders were Portland, Oregon, and the Bay Area. And that was about 6 months before I was done with my credential program. And at that time, I was worried that I wasn't going to be able to get a job in California because there was lots of teaching layoffs at the time. And so I had been looking at Portland, Oregon as well, because Oregon and California have a deal set up so that they'll accept your credential from either state. You don't have to go get more training if you go teach there. And so I was like, oh, I could go to Portland. And so that was just another tick in my, this must be the hand of God. Like we almost ended up in the same place at the same time, kind of thinking. And kind of an almost magical worldview, right? So yeah, so we had been dating like 13 days when we decided that we were meant to be.
A whole 13 days.
A whole 13 days. It's so silly to me, but we were like, we know this is like ridiculous, stereotypical Mormon story, so we're not gonna tell anybody.
Say a little more about it. What do you mean a stereotypical Mormon story?
We knew so many people who like went to BYU and dated for a couple weeks or a couple months and then were married 3 months later. Like it is such a common story. And we were like, we aren't even at BYU. And so we're like, we can't tell anybody because people will just be like, oh, you're one of those people. And so we were like, we'll keep it a secret, because this was like September. I'd been teaching for like 3 or 4 weeks. And my birthday was in December. And Jeff was being sent across the country in the early October to do sea marshal training at FLETC for a new job that he'd been shifted around in departments at Coast Guard Island. And so we're like, we'll just wait. We'll just wait till you get back, and then we'll make it like this big official thing. And then it will look like we've been doing, dating for 4 whole months before we decided to.
There you go. A really long and drawn out dating relationship.
Right. In Mormon world. Yeah. But it was like the following weekend was General Conference, and they had their priesthood session, and Jeff went with my dad and brothers to the priesthood session. So I was at home with my mom and sisters. And my mom was like, so I know you haven't been dating very long, but do you think this relationship could, go that way? And I was like, it already has? And my mom was like, what? And I was like, well, he hasn't like officially proposed or anything yet. Like we haven't even we just decided that we like each other enough that that's what we wanted to do. Like we were in love and we want to get married, but like we weren't going to do anything about it until like December. And my mom was like, have you picked a date? And I was like, no, we haven't picked a date. Are you kidding? No. And she pulls out the calendar. It's like, what about when you're on Christmas break? And I was like, that's in 4 months and he's not getting back until like early December. No. And she's like, well, you can't wait too long because, they don't want to risk. So, and I was like, no, I am not doing a 3-month engagement with him gone 2 of the 3 months. I'm not doing that. And so my mom's like, well, when's your next school break? And I was like, spring break in like April. And so she was looking at the calendar and she's like, oh, when does spring break start? I was like, it's like the week before Easter or something. And so she's like, oh, that Saturday is April 15th. That's my parents' anniversary. And so I was like, oh, what a cool coincidence. So we got married on my parents' anniversary. And it's funny because we considered it a very long engagement because we were engaged for 6 whole months before we got married. And there was a lot, our bishop talked to us so many times just to double check we weren't doing anything we weren't supposed to be doing, and kept it each of us have 3 callings. He was keeping us super busy. And we were like, I'm a brand new teacher. I cannot fulfill all these little callings that you've got. And in the Mormon church, the callings work a lot differently than in Community of Christ. It's not you feel like God wants you to do something. And then, you kind of work that out. The bishop decides what God has called you to do and gives you these jobs. And saying no to the bishop is huge, bad no-no. They tell you can, but then you're really just denying a call from God. So we got married in April, and then we waited not quite a year, I think, before we decided to start our family. And we got pregnant. Well, our oldest was born in September of 2007. So you do the math.
Okay.
My brain is not giving me the math right now. So we waited a little bit, and he was born a year and a half after, well, not quite a year and a half after we were married. So, 8-9 months. And he was coming up to the end of his 4-year enlistment. And I had 6 months left of the school year. So he decided to extend his enlistment for 6 months, and so that we could stay in Alameda. And then when I was done with the school year, we moved down to Monterey because he had gotten accepted at CSU Monterey Bay. So we went down there for him to do his schooling, and we had our first. And I think he was in his 3rd week of school when we had our oldest. And he was a very difficult baby because he had GERD. So he had really bad acid reflux. And so he cried a lot. And because he was in pain, every time we tried to nurse, like he couldn't tolerate like laying down and having the acid reflux, and he'd scream, and I'd be like, just nurse and you'll feel better. And so like I developed kind of like this really deep postpartum depression. And I didn't really know anybody down in Monterey. And we'd met a few people at church, one of whom actually happened to be somebody who knew Jeff growing up. They both worked at the St. George Pool together. Her husband was at the Language Institute. He was becoming a translator. And so our babies were born she was also pregnant. Our babies were born like a couple weeks apart. But she was working, and her baby was in daycare, and her husband was doing school just like Jeff. So we didn't get to like see them and hang out with them a whole lot. So I was mostly just alone all the time. And I had been raised to believe that once you have a kid, you do not keep working. That is like, you do not. And so I was being a stay-at-home mom while my husband went to school, and he was getting the GI Bill. So it's not like we were totally penniless, but it was financially difficult, and it was really, really lonely. I remember for a long time, and we ended up having our first three kids while he was in school. And our friends moved away when our babies were like a year. And then we sort of had some friends after that, but nobody our age. We were just alone. We were alone a lot. And I was alone a lot because Jeff was at school and he was making friends with his classmates and he was doing all these things. This was the sacrifice I was supposed to make as the wife and the mom, to make sure that he could be the provider and he could have the career of his dreams and he could do all those things. And I had to make these sacrifices. And I don't remember the sun shining during those years. I have a few days where I remember there was sun, but I mostly just remember nothing but clouds all the time. The weather in Marina is kind of like that, but not as badly as it felt. And I was really depressed, and I didn't know that I was depressed because I thought you had to be crying all the time to be depressed. And I wasn't crying. More than anything, I was angry all the time. And I didn't know why I was angry. I just knew I was angry all the time, and the littlest things would just send me flying. There was a lot of self-blame, and I'm not doing good enough. It's because I'm not praying enough. I'm not reading my scriptures enough. I'm not being a good enough mom, and I'm not listening to the Spirit, and God's not telling me what's wrong with my kid or whatever. I don't know how to help them. I don't know how to be the parent they need, and a lot of it was just kind of self-inflicted, just awful, awful negative self-talk, and a lot of self-blame and a lot of shame. Because my kids Jonathan especially, he had a really hard time with church and sitting in church and going to the little kid classes and doing all those things. Most kids, like their parents would bring coloring books for them and they would be fine. And they would go to their class and they'd love nursery and they'd love primary and they'd just love everything. And he would scream and we had to go with him and we had to stay with him the whole time. And I thought it was because I was doing something wrong. And during that time, they asked me to work with the young women's organization. So the girls that were 12 to 18. And that was triply hard because I had all kinds of trauma around teen girls. And so I was trying so hard to do all the good things and be the good leader and be a good mom and be supportive of my husband while he was going to school. And I just wanted to do something for me. But I felt guilty and ashamed for even thinking that because you weren't supposed to. You were supposed to support your husband. Motherhood was supposed to be the only thing you wanted. It was supposed to be the most fulfilling thing ever. And I didn't feel that way. I just felt really, really lonely. And I missed teaching. I really did not like working with teenage girls at all. And it was just a really, really difficult period of time. And all those little things that had been sitting in the back of my head started to reemerge. And I started kind of
developing these ideas of like, well, I think they're wrong about this thing or the other thing. And I would dismiss them, but no, they can't be wrong. 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 And so I just kind of suffered for a while. And when he graduated school, he had trouble finding a job because this was 2011. So we just had the housing crash and the job market was terrible. And we had to move out of student housing, but he didn't have a job. He was working part-time for REI. He was able to transfer to the Sacramento REI store. And he worked all the hours they were willing to give him. And at this point, we had 3 little kids. And we were renting a house and my husband was working part-time. And even if I had decided to go back to school, a teacher's salary does not pay daycare for 3 children. If we'd had 1, we could have swung it. Maybe even 2, but not for 3. There was just no way. It's way too expensive. So we were just trying to struggle through. The church, for a little while, we went to the church to ask for some help. But that was such a shame-filled process. Like, it was so shaming. And because the idea was you do it yourself, and then you go to your family, and then you go to the government, and then you can come to the church. And we asked they had, I don't think they have them anymore, but at the time they had bishop storehouses in California, and Sacramento's actually had one of their canning facilities. And so we were allowed to go to the bishop's storehouse a couple times, but the food in the bishop's storehouse was really, really poor quality. It was like really gristly meat. It was mushy, red, delicious apples and iceberg lettuce. And just going just felt so shaming. It was like, oh, I shouldn't be here. I shouldn't be here. I shouldn't be here. But my parents weren't supporting us. Like, I still had younger siblings at home and in college and doing all kinds of things. And so my parents couldn't really support us. And Jeff's parents couldn't support us either. They were all the way in Utah. And his parents had never had like a ton of extra money. And so we were just kind of stuck trying to figure it out ourselves. And we ended up, over the course of the 2 years that he worked for USGS, he made just enough salary that we didn't qualify for governmental aid, but not enough that we could pay our bills and buy food. The church, like, they're willing to help you a couple times, but they don't want you to be on any kind of long-term assistance. And so for that 2 years, we were putting food on credit card because we felt like we had no other option, no other choice. That really, really created this huge cognitive dissonance for me about the message that the church was giving us about, well, if you're faithful and you pay your 10% tithing, 10% on your gross, not on your net, and you are reading your scriptures and going to church every week and faithfully fulfilling your callings, the Lord will make sure you are provided for. And we were doing those things and we were not provided for. And in this period, like, we had another kid because we felt like that's what we were supposed to do, right? God will provide if you're faithful. So, we faithfully had a 4th child, even though we couldn't afford to feed the 3 we had. And Jeff was always like, during this period, he was constantly applying to every other job he could find. And he wasn't getting interviews, which just kind of deepened the idea that maybe we were doing something wrong. And every time it came back to that, like, a little something in the back of my brain was like, this is not our fault. And so some really big cracks started to open up. And in getting my degree, I had gotten a degree in history and a minor in education. And part of that education, we had learned about the realities of poverty in America. And so the ways I had kind of justified the church's view on things was kind of crumbled under our own experience in poverty. And so I was really starting to find myself disagreeing more and more with things that were being said over the pulpit and being like, but that's not true. That is not what it looks like. And we would hear a lot of these supposed to be faith-affirming stories told from the pulpit about, people who paid their tithing and then magical, and they weren't going to be, they had to decide, do we get Christmas presents for our kids or do we pay our tithing? And they ultimately decided to pay their tithing and magically Christmas showed up on their front doorstep on Christmas Eve. And those sorts of stories never happened for us. And I was like, okay, so either they're lying and those things never happened to anybody, or people must really hate us because they're not willing to do that for us, or God's mad at us. I was like, there's only a couple of options here. And so I was battling with myself over, is this my fault? Are people just mean, or are they lying to us? And so I kind of had this battle going in my head. By the time we had our fourth, I had come to understand that what I had experienced after each of my other three was postpartum depression. So I knew it was coming. And I remember we heard a lot about, like, you can just pray your way out of depression. And I remember trying so hard. Maybe if I just look for joy, maybe that will fix this. And sometime after our fourth was not quite a year, she was like 9 months. And Jeff got an interview with the company he's with now, East Bay Mud. And we were offered a house. He got the job and we bought the house, and things kind of settled for a little while. We're like, oh, we have enough money that we can breathe, we can eat, we can pay off our credit card, we can kind of relax a little bit. And so we thought things were going to get easy. And then I got pregnant with a fifth. And at the 16-week appointment, the doctor said to me, there's no heartbeat. And I was crushed. I was devastated. So this was the day before my fourth child's first birthday when we found out. And Jeff's sister was getting married his twin was getting married a couple weeks later. And because I was so far along, there's only one specialist in the Kaiser system in all of Northern California who could perform a special procedure that was a little more complicated than if it was just like an 8-week miscarriage. But they didn't have any appointments open for 2 weeks. His sister's wedding was during that time period. And I was like, well, I'm not going to sit here at home by myself with 4 kids and this devastating news while you go to the wedding, because you're not missing your sister's wedding. So we decided to go. And the day after her wedding, and I miscarried. They had to take me to the hospital via ambulance, and I very nearly bled to death. They couldn't get an OBGYN into the hospital because it was a Sunday, and they were all at church because it was Utah. I was just constantly bleeding for like 4 hours before they got an OB there. He was so callous and so cavalier and so like, oh, this is no big deal. You almost died, but this is no big deal. So we drove home the next day, and I contacted my doctor here, and she had me come in for like blood tests and all that sort of stuff. And she was livid. And I remember just being in a state of shock for a long time and being really sad, obviously grieving, but feeling like I couldn't grieve in a lot of ways. A lot of the things that people would say at church was like, oh, well, I guess this baby was so righteous that that they didn't need to be tested on earth, and God just needed to call him home before they even came. But so are you saying that I wouldn't have been a good enough mom? What? And then like the cracks, like just huge cracks started to form. And we ended up having 2 more miscarriages after that. And nobody could tell us why. The doctors didn't have a clue. I received so many healing, hands-on head kind of blessings, so many prayers, so much just scrupulously trying to be so good, because if I was good enough, God would send me to the right specialist who would know what was wrong. God would put the right people on my path to make this stop, or would have blessed me with a baby. And so many people were telling me stories about their own journeys with miscarriage and infertility, and how just magically God placed the right people. They just happened to meet the right people at the right time who solved their problem. And that wasn't happening. And I was like, I don't understand what I'm doing wrong. What am I doing wrong that I'm not getting these same blessings as these other people? And so during that time period, I was really kind of developing, I guess, my own theology of just that they don't understand. They don't understand. And they're saying, all these people around me, the people in my ward, the people at church headquarters during conference, they're saying things based on their life experience, and they haven't experienced these things, so they don't know. And in my mind, I was coming to the idea at the time that life just is what it is, and stuff happens. And it's not your fault, and it's not because you weren't good enough or you weren't righteous enough. And sometimes terrible people have all the right things work out for them. And it has nothing to do with God. Nothing at all to do with God.
We're going to pause things here because there's so much more to say. So want to thank you for being with us for this part of the Fair Trade episode in Faith Unfiltered podcast, where I am having a conversation with Jennifer Toone. Watch for the second part of this episode. Thanks for being with us. Have a great day, and we'll see you soon.